What if the thing you've been calling irritability is actually information? The angry tears, the resentment, the argument about the dishes that turned into 17 other things, the feeling of, please, for the love of God, nobody ask me for anything else. Or that fantasy where you get into your car and you drive somewhere where nobody needs you, nobody wants a snack. Those aren't signs that you've become angry or an ungrateful person, but they can absolutely be signs that something in you has gone unattended, because caring for everyone else in your life doesn't always feel like you're carrying too much. It can feel like being responsible or being helpful or being the person who handles it or being good at your job, being a good partner, being a good mom, until you start noticing you're edgier, resentful, exhausted. You don't quite recognize yourself inside the life that you have worked so hard to build. And our instinct is usually to ask in those moments, how do I make this stop? But I think a more important question is this: what is this feeling trying to tell me? Welcome back to Don't Cut Your Own Bangs, the podcast for high-functioning humans with big feelings who are trying to make sense of what's happening inside of them without needing to become a completely different person to do it. I am Danielle Ireland, a therapist, speaker, and storyteller, and your host. And today, we are starting a 3-part mini-series within Don't Cut Your Own Bangs, a conversation about something I cannot seem to stop thinking about. What happens when caring quietly becomes carrying? This series actually grew out of a presentation I recently gave called Supporting Others Without Losing Yourself. It was something I gave for people in the helping profession. And I loved this talk so much because something became clear almost immediately during the Q&A afterward, which was there's a lot more to say. There were questions we didn't have time to get into, nuances that I really wanted to explore, and parts of this conversation that deserve more room than a keynote could give them. And I left thinking, oh, I am not done here. So I want to do that here with you. So over these next 3 episodes, I'm going to take my time and we're going to really talk about what it actually looks like to care deeply about other people without abandoning yourself in the process. And today, we are starting with that first part, the part that gets overlooked a lot, recognizing when something isn't working. But before we get started, I just want to say thank you. This little corner of the internet has become something that is so near and dear to me. And if you would like to help it keep growing, one of the easiest ways to do that is to simply follow the show wherever you are listening and leave a quick review if you haven't already. It helps the show more than you probably know. It tells the podcast platforms that this is a conversation worth sharing, and it helps people who might be quietly carrying stumble into exactly the conversation that they needed today. So thank you for listening, for sharing, for leaving reviews, and for helping build this little community with me. Okay, let's talk about why everybody is suddenly getting on our nerves. I think we imagine that if we are carrying too much, we'll know. We will have some cinematic epiphany. The music will swell, we'll stare meaningfully into the middle, distant horizon and announce, I'm burnt out. That's actually rarely, never, ever, ever how it happens. It leaks. You get resentful. You get edgier than usual. You're crying about something that you wouldn't ever normally cry about, or you are furious about the dishes that never end. You hear yourself snap at somebody that you love, and then you immediately think, where the heck did that come from? Or there's even a quieter version. I have a good life. Why don't I feel better inside of it? And that is where I want to begin, because the feeling that keeps interrupting your life might not be the thing you need to get rid of. That might be the very thing you need to listen to. I want to take a moment and talk about what it would actually look like when we're not completely aware that it's too much, but it starts to leak and spill out in other ways. So I mentioned angry tears or edginess and frustrations, certainly losing your temper or starting an argument about something that you're like, well, this is really important. But then you start to think later, why was that the hill I was willing to die on? I mean, I know laundry is important. And yes, I know we need to share the workload at home, but did it require us going that far and that deep? Or fantasizing about an escape wanting everyone to leave you alone, feeling completely empty, or just that sense of, if anybody's watched Inside Out 2, that sense of ennui, like, ugh, everything is just a little boring and a little empty. And that emptiness can quickly, when we aren't in touch with it, when we're not aware of it, if we haven't named it or created any context around it, can turn into behaviors that lead to us sometimes feeling worse after, like drinking a little too much, shopping a little too much, scrolling more than we want, or finding things to fill our time that keep us moving and feeling busy. But the moment we stop and have a second to think, it's like, well, where did the day go? Where did the time go? Why do I not feel restored? And just as a slight aside, I am not judging any of those things. A drink with a friend, a glass of wine at night, or wanting to do a little shopping, buying something that maybe you don't need. This is not about judgment. This is a judgment-free zone. It's when we are trying to manufacture a little bit of relief, and then that feeling doesn't go away. And then we keep going back to the things that are known and familiar that offer a little temporary hit of relief. And then we find ourselves in this revolving pattern. And it's that pattern that I want to address, not to villainize or call out any one particular outlet, because at the end of the day, however you want to treat yourself, that is absolutely your prerogative. But there's another big component to this, particularly within a family system, particularly within partnerships, relationships, and this can be at work or at home, but it is feeling unseen and waiting for somebody to notice you, waiting for someone to notice your effort or your impact, or waiting for someone to really notice what you need. It's like, I want somebody to know for me, and I want somebody to rescue me and come to me with the permission slip that my plan to step away will not inconvenience anyone in any way. And the other thing I want to gently call out in this process is sometimes the barrier to recognition is a subtle form of shame. And it's this thought, this shameful thought in thinking, I chose this life. Why don't I want to participate in it right now? Like everything I asked for, I'm sitting in a version of. And I recognize that this is a very potentially privileged and specific lens. But I will say, this is a population of people I work with a lot when I'm speaking in companies or when I'm working with individuals in therapy. To some extent, there is this sense that I built the life that a previous version of me would have dreamt of. And why am I still feeling so exhausted within it? So the arguments about the dishes that really aren't about the dishes, or the angry tears, or the frustration, or even hollow feeling. I'm going to say something potentially radical. I don't think that in and of itself is the problem. I think more deeply that all of those are symptomatic, because the problem itself is actually becoming visible. It's like if someone around you has a cold and you were exposed to a bug, and so that bug is in your system, but then it makes itself known to you 24 to 72 hours later when the symptoms start to arise. Very similarly, in this case, when we're talking about going from caring deeply about who we are, how we show up, how we work, how we love, how we show up in our families, and carrying too much, that line or that threshold, I think that all of the crunchy, crispy, just painful friction points that we're naming here as examples, the problem is making itself visible to us. Not any one thing in particular is the problem. This leads me to another important point, which is that when we are starting to have these feelings or experiences come to the surface that could be and are likely indicating a larger problem, this is when we often turn where our attention is, which is on somebody else. And so if my attention is on my spouse, my boss, my coworker, my children, because my eyes look out, not in, right? I'm looking out at my world and I'm feeling all of this turmoil, or I'm feeling this discontent, I'm feeling this emptiness, and I'm looking out. It is natural that if that's where my attention is, that's where I think the problem is. And that might sound to us, or actually be expressed to us in this language like, nobody helps me, or nobody sees how much I'm doing. My partner should know this. It should be obvious. My boss is asking way too much, or Everybody needs something from me. And there also may be an enormous truth to those observations, but we're not using self awareness as a way to explain away an actual lack of support. But what we are trying to name is what actually happens if my entire path forward to feeling free and feeling better and feeling whole is dependent upon somebody else changing. And what is potentially at stake or at a detriment to me if I become so focused on their behavior that I stop becoming curious about my experience. If what I need to feel whole and complete is my partner being different or my boss giving me more flexibility and giving me the raise, if what I need to feel whole and good in my life is contingent and rests on the thin razor's edge of somebody doing what I need them to do, God, I mean, just insert, if you are a parent of small kids, use them as the example. If my mood was solely dependent on my kids getting ready when I ask them to, or picking up when I ask them to, like doing what I need them to do, and I'm using air quotes there, I'm going to miss a lot of really important information about my own internal experience. And I want to mention too that this is not my way of saying that other people in your life are impacting your life, because of course they are. But your experience is the heart of this conversation, not just other people's treatment of you, but your experience and how you center yourself in that. Your feelings aren't a verdict, they're information. Resentment doesn't automatically mean you need to leave your marriage and quit your job. Exhaustion doesn't automatically mean that you need to cut ties with all of your friends. And irritability doesn't mean you're a terrible mother. The emotion doesn't necessarily draw a conclusion, but it does tell us where to look. I want to take you back to a couples therapy session I had when my daughter Logan was 8 weeks old, and what was happening in that room and what came out of that story. So what I didn't know at the time was that I was knee deep in postpartum depression, had no awareness of it. I'm standing, I'm rocking Logan. I'm also nursing her with like a blanket over me. And I don't remember exactly what led to me saying what I said, but I remember what made the room stop and all of us became really aware of something important. I said that I'm drowning. I just remember rocking her. She's nursing. She's falling asleep. And I just remember saying, I'm drowning. And that stopped David right in his tracks. It stopped our therapist at the time right in his tracks. And it helped us externalize the challenge we were facing and we couldn't name. It became, oh, there is something bigger going on here than a communication issue, a communication challenge. And what started to come out of that conversation and what has continued to evolve since that recognition that I had, and by extension, we all had, was that I didn't know how to name. I didn't have language for, I didn't have context for. I also probably didn't have the resources because I was so physically exhausted and sleep deprived. But what David and I were doing is we were essentially taking our old operating model, our old operating system from life before kids, and trying to apply it to the way that life worked now with an 8-week-old, being sleep deprived, carrying postpartum depression, all of the hormonal changes in nursing. When David feels overwhelmed, he wants to go back to what he knows. When I feel overwhelmed and out of control, I go back to what I know. And so we were bringing these old operating systems, this old software, and bringing it into a new version of our life. So he gets busy, he gets to work, he doubles down on the areas he feels like he's got the greatest sense of impact. And I try to control everything in my mind. So I'm noticing, anticipating, remembering, deciding, keeping track. I'm juggling all these things mentally. And so I'm having my own separate experience. He's having his own separate experience. And we're both carrying needs that were sort of spoken, but they were more implicit, less explicit. And it all came together in a sense in that moment, in that room, I'm drowning. And from there, we were able to actually separate, oh, this isn't actually me against you or you against me. There's no judgment. You're not doing anything wrong and I'm not doing anything wrong. But there is a problem. And so me naming that feeling at that moment in time allowed me to center my experience in the conversation we were having. And so what came as a result was, in essence, a lot of shedding, a lot of letting go, a lot of recognition of, I know what hypothetically I should be able to do, and that's just not where I am. And I know like what you're used to, but that's not where we can be in this moment in time. And so things had to shift, but the shift couldn't happen until the recognition happened. And I use this as an example because in that moment, what I can see now so clearly is that we were both trying to operate in ways that we just weren't fully acknowledging. And we weren't acknowledging that it just wasn't working. It's like we knew something felt off, but when you don't know what to do and you don't know what the problem is, you're just going to keep going back to what's familiar. And something else too that's important to note, that when you are sleep deprived, depressed, stressed, or pressed, and I know I'm alliterating a lot. It almost made this like a depression Dr. Seuss, but you're going to revert back to a younger version of you, or you're going to revert back to, I'll say, a less mature version of you. And it's going to be a really familiar pattern. A lot of times we revert back to somewhere between maybe 8 years old, 13 years old, when our resources feel limited, when freedom feels scarce, when sleep, rest, when all of that's hitting you at different sides. And that can happen in so many different expressions of life. For me in this story, it just happens to be having our first baby. But we were using old information to navigate a new experience that neither one of us had ever been in before. And naming it didn't create a villain and it didn't create a victim. What it allowed for us to do was externalize a problem, create context around it, and then address it from there. And that was the starting point, not the ending point, on conversations that we are still continuing to revisit to this day. For example, like, what does an equitable marriage look like when something feels wildly out of balance? Or is there an invisible need that needs to be made visible? Or when have one of us been, because we are continually evolving, what worked before won't automatically work right now in this moment. What does something that feels equitable look like when life itself feels wildly out of balance? Or what has been invisible for a long time that needs to be made visible? What have I maybe been silently expecting him to notice that he just doesn't see? And vice versa. There was a moment actually this morning where something that had been on our list of basically just something getting removed from the garage, it had been on our list for, like, let's say, and by the way, it's not an actual list, it's just like a mental ticker, but something that's been on our minds to get done for, I'll say, most of the summer. And this morning it was gone. And I noticed it was gone, but I didn't say anything. And so he actually called it out. He was like, "Hey, did you notice?" And I was like, "Oh crap. Yeah, totally." Like, relationship high five. But these themes, I think that sometimes too, and it bears repeating, that sometimes the biggest lessons in life do bear repeating, and it's not a reflection of failure or a fault. It's just a rinse and repeat cycle that often happens when we are doing any kind of emotional work. But I think one of the most important things to highlight from all of that is that when you're recognizing that there is a problem, or you're naming some version, your version of "I'm drowning," it doesn't have to be anyone's fault for it to need your attention. So when we have these big, hard, maybe isolating or scary, heavy feelings, it is very natural and instinctual to want to just shake your hands, shake it off. Okay, how do I get rid of it? Great. Okay, I recognize there's a problem. Ugh, icky, disgusting. I don't like it. How do I make this feeling go away? And what I want to invite you to do is, instead of trying to get rid of the feeling, instead shift to asking, what is this feeling trying to tell me? Because that is the only real way out. You can numb it, you can avoid it, you can stuff it, you can bury it, you can keep it in a, really nice, organized box and put it in a closet, but it's not going to go away until we start to get a little bit more curious about it. Resentment is often pointed toward an unattended need. Irritability, likely telling you that you're overloaded. Exhaustion definitely contains information. Discontent contains big information. Fantasies about escape, wanting to run away to a desert island, that contains really important information. It doesn't automatically dictate action, and it also does not mean that everything needs to be abandoned or that everything is a problem. But not looking at it will only make it get louder the next time it comes around. The next time it grabs your attention, it's going to grip harder, going to grip deeper, and it's going to be a lot harder to ignore. It is easy when we're in those big, big, turbulent emotional states to think that, well, this feeling is the problem and the person I'm looking at is the problem, so I will leave. Or this feeling is a problem and I don't want to deal with this mess, so I'm going to throw it all away. Big emotions don't necessarily require big action. So many times, oftentimes, there's a 10% that do require big action and another 10% that require big action, like your outliers. But there's this 80% bell curve in the middle that sometimes the recognition alone is enough to make that feeling come down and shrink down to something you can actually hold and look at and try to understand. One of the most powerful mindset shifts, and it's one of the parts of my talk that I love delivering the most, but I really think it's necessary to provide a little bit of context around it. And it can be referenced a couple of different ways. One is radical responsibility, but the other that I like is that we are the architect of our experience. And by that, what I mean, and this is in no way saying that if something happens to you that you don't like, it's your fault. Because this is one, shame is not a helpful emotion. Shame doesn't drive action. Shame doesn't drive change. Shame just drives us down. It keeps us quiet and it keeps us stuck. What I mean is, if we treat our lives like we are the ones who are building it, we are the ones who can tear it down and rebuild, repair, restore. If I choose to see my life as something that I am the architect of, what that creates for me is agency. That creates options. That creates opportunities. It gives me something to become interested in and invested in. Because if life is just happening to me, if I'm a victim of circumstance, then what power do I have to make any difference? What would the foregone conclusion be? Well, therefore, I won't do anything. I can't do anything. But if I am the architect of my experience, it doesn't mean that every single thing in my life is mine to control. What it means is, if my internal experience is information and I am the architect of my experience, with that information and within that context, what choices do I have? And now we have moved to a place that empowers us, that centers us, and gives us choices. Because that's really when we feel threatened, when we feel pressed, stressed, depressed, depleted, what we feel is we have limited choices, limited resources. But by sitting with the thought, I am the architect of my experience. My feelings are information that are roadmaps for me. They are wildly important information, not something to just swipe and ignore. They are my internal GPS system. Looking at that as information, what can I build? What can I improve? And the other thing that this approach can invite is hopefully something, and this is my deepest intention, that your experience doesn't have to become an emergency before it deserves your attention. If I can take responsibility for myself at a time where it's not at a 10, the house isn't on fire, then that means that I have opportunities to set myself up to feel safer and more supported before the problem gets too big. If you're listening to this conversation right now and thinking about your team, your organization, or your colleagues, or honestly just a group of women that you love and thinking, God, we really need to talk about this, we can. This is actually one of my favorite things that I get to do. In addition to being a therapist and hosting this podcast, I am a professional speaker, and I get invited to companies and conferences and women's groups and helping professionals. And I love helping them have conversations exactly like this one. In fact, this series grew out of one of those very talks. It's called Supporting Others Without Losing Yourself, Learning the Difference Between Caring Deeply and Carrying Everything. And what I love about speaking, it isn't standing in front of a room and giving everybody another list of things to do. What I do love is creating the kind of room where people recognize themselves, where we laugh, where somebody thinks, oh my gosh, that was just me. I just did that. Where we understand ourselves a little differently and lead with language and tools that we can actually use when Monday morning rolls around. This is the kind of conversation that I could have all day, every day, and never get tired of having it. So if you're listening and thinking, my people need this conversation, I would love to have it with you. Your company, your conference, your retreat. I am also extremely open to somebody deciding that what they really need is to have this conversation on a tropical beach with a Mai Tai. I will make myself available for that. You can learn more about my speaking work and get in touch with me at Danielle@DanielleIreland.com. I would love to meet your people. Okay, back to us. So this is often the point in the process, particularly when I'm working with therapy clients where they recognize there's a problem, they see themselves in it, they started to get some context and language, and now they immediately want to jump to, okay, yep, this doesn't feel good. What do I do? And recognition itself is something that doesn't always feel productive. So we underestimate it. But recognition is the most important step. And I say that it's not an exaggeration. Recognition is the most important step. It has to be, because nothing can change until the problem is seen. We can't name it. We can't treat it. We can't explain it. We can't hold space for it. We can't do anything for it if it isn't recognized. And so recognition is the step. So when somebody, a client, or even somebody in a talk, it's like, okay, this talk is really great, but like, what am I going to do Monday morning? The fact that you can see yourself in this concept, that is the first step to changing it, truly. And that is a step. So the doing, like, well, what do I do? The doing part is already being done. You're already on the path. If you see yourself, recognize yourself in any of these processes, the process of change has already started. It's difficult to intentionally change a pattern that you haven't recognized. And once something becomes visible, this is the other thing I love. When something becomes visible, it becomes harder and harder to ignore. So it doesn't mean that change is going to become radical overnight, but give yourself credit because the change is happening. But if you're sitting here nodding along thinking, okay, great, can you give me something? Yes, of course, gladly. I would give you 2 follow-up questions. If you were sitting in a therapy session with me, or if we were in a presentation together and you were like, okay, I see the problem, I can name it, I can name the problem. Here are the 2 follow-up questions. And this is what I'd recommend you do next. What am I feeling? What might I need? And it's not about drafting an action plan. And it's not really even about creating this massive journal entry, but it's giving yourself a follow-up from just being able to give yourself credit for naming it. Okay, I can feel that I'm drowning. I can feel that I'm overwhelmed. I can feel that I'm burnt out. I can feel this void in my life and I don't know what to fill it with. So I'm filling it with all of the things that make me feel like crap the next day. Oh, that's a lot. That's heavy. What am I feeling? What might I need? Just start there. It's not about an action plan. Just listen. What if you actually didn't have to solve exactly what you were feeling today? What if you started by believing that it is simply worth listening to? Not believing every single thought, not buying into every story that fear is telling you, and not even worrying about the interpretation, but acknowledging the reality inside of you. You're frustrated, you're lonely, you're resentful, you're tired, you're overwhelmed. You want something that you haven't let yourself want. You need something you haven't let yourself need. That is information. And that recognition matters because it is incredibly difficult. I'll even go as far as to say impossible to change something that we haven't allowed ourselves to see. So this week, don't fix, just notice, get curious, and ask yourself, what has been trying to get my attention? And then listen. We are going to be picking up right back here next week because recognizing what you need is one thing. Honoring it is something else entirely, especially when honoring what you need could disappoint someone, make somebody uncomfortable, or change an expectation, disrupt a pattern, or require that you say something that another person may not understand. So next week, we are talking about the question, why do I need you to agree with my need before I'm allowed to honor it? And what happens when we stop handing someone else the key to our freedom? That's episode 2. If today's conversation made you think of someone who has been carrying a lot lately, send it to them. And make sure you're following Don't Cut Your Own Bangs wherever you're listening so that episode 2 is waiting for you when it comes out. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you next week. Before you go, I wanted to share one more thing that is delighting me, because when we talk about big, hard, sometimes heavier topics, I love to try to bring some levity and lightness whenever I can, not to honor the work that's been done, but to also remind myself that there is so much more than this one specific wound, this hard thing. Life is full and rich and complex, and so many things are happening at once. And the thing that is bringing me the most delight right now, if you follow me on social media, you may already know that, but if you don't, maybe you haven't seen it. But I have been just loving watching hummingbirds. And I call them my hummingbirds. I don't know why I censored myself for the podcast to not sound possessive, but they're my hummingbirds. I have a hummingbird feeder that I love that has this gorgeous, like red kind of cover on it. And we have been getting so much heavy rain where we are. And I've noticed that the hummingbirds just seem to love sitting on their little perch and drinking their nectar and getting a little respite from the rain. And it brings me endless joy and pleasure to see them because they are so small and yet powerful. And they just have this magical quality to them. And it brings me endless joy to watch them. So I guess you know that I'm in my 40s because I'm talking about birds. But hey, nature is magic, y'all. Nature is magic. So I'd love to know what brings you delight. I'd love to know what's bringing you some joy and happiness right now. Share it with me. I really want to hear it because the best things in life are shared. Well, that's all for now. I'll see you next time. And in the meantime, whatever you do, don't cut your own bangs.